Prince George, British Columbia is constantly ranked as one of the most dangerous cities in Canada, due in equal parts to it being one of the larger cities in northern BC, and it being a major transportation hub. Prince George rests almost perfectly between a number of much larger cities, including Juneau, Anchorage, Vancouver, Seattle, Calgary, and Edmonton. Because of this location, the city acts as a major crossroad for highways 16 and 97. The former, which cuts through Canada and connects Alaska to the lower 48, and the latter, which is more well known by its ominous nickname, the Highway of Tears. June 19th, 1988 was a relatively normal end-of-spring day for this region, in which the weather was remarkably mild and nothing seemed too out of the ordinary for Prince George's roughly 60,000 residents. That evening, though, emergency services were called to a fire that had begun to rage out of control at the Carpool Car Wash near 3rd Avenue and Cassiar Street. This is an area that is almost equal parts residential and commercial, surrounded by an industrial district to the immediate north and downtown Prince George to the south. A group of onlookers began to gather around at about 9:30 that evening, as the fire began to engulf the car wash itself. The cause of the fire became clear very quickly. A car had been set on fire inside a bay of this car wash, seemingly intentionally. First responders began to arrive at around 9:30 p.m., and firefighters worked to contain and extinguish this blaze. Just as the fire began to singe the signage of the car wash and the flames reached the roof of the building, the fire is curtailed within minutes, but immediately the responding officers began trying to figure out who this vehicle belonged to. Their first concern was that someone might be seriously injured or wounded because of the blaze, but when it became clear that nobody was coming forward to take ownership of this car, officers became suspicious that this might be some kind of insurance scheme, or a stolen vehicle put to the torch by some young troublemakers in the region. The vehicle that was burned in the fire was easily identified as a 1983 Volkswagen Jetta, a two-door sedan with a sunroof and missing license plates. The lack of any readable paperwork inside the vehicle, or really any belongings, made identifying the car's owner a bit of a headache. But the following day, June 20th, 1988, investigators were able to piece together the vehicle's VIN number. That, in return, led them to the identity of the vehicle's owner, a college student from Alaska who had left home about a week prior, who was now nowhere to be found, and whose disappearance would spawn a bizarre, terrifying mystery spanning thousands of miles. This is the story of Philip Fraser. Welcome to Unresolved. I am your host, Micheal Whelan. Before I continue on in the story, I want to take a moment to give a huge thank you to my friend, Damian Moore, who supplied a large chunk of the research and writing for this episode. Damian runs the website American Crime Journal, which you can find by Googling American Crime Journal or visiting the URL mytruecrime.com. Damian always puts out great content, so make sure to check out his site. If you would like to learn more about this show, or myself, just listen through to the close of this episode, or visit the Unresolved podcast website at unresolved.me. Now, without any further ado, here is the story of Philip Fraser. Philip Innes Fraser was born on January 3rd, 1965, and was just one of three sons born to his parents, Robert and Shirley Fraser. Philip's father, Dr. Robert Fraser, was an internist from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, whose work had brought him out to Alaska. He loved the region so much that he decided to permanently relocate to Alaska, where he would plant his roots and raise a family. While in Alaska, Dr. Robert Fraser became well known as one of the region's most renowned experts on tuberculosis, and he eventually served as the director of TB control for the Alaska Department of Public Health. Philip's mother, Dr. Shirley Fraser, was also a well-renowned doctor that worked as a neurologist. Both of Philip's parents were incredibly smart and hard-working individuals, who made sure to instill similar values in their three sons. Robert Jr., Will, and, of course, Philip. Philip would grow up in Anchorage, Alaska, and, like his parents and brothers, was incredibly smart. However, as he got older, he began to shift his focus into the arts, taking a liking to literature and music. He would become an exceptional violinist, having taken to the instrument early in life without his parents' urging. That seemed to be a common theme for Philip. He was a good kid, but constantly wanted to find his own way in life. In fact, a high school friend of Philip later stated, quote, "He danced to the beat of his own drum, sort of a rebel, but not the fight with his parents and take up smoking type. He was following in his mom and dad's footsteps, but it was going to be on his own terms." Philip graduated from West Anchorage High School in 1982 at the age of 17. Later that year, he began attending Western Maryland College on the other side of the country, which had been his father's alma mater. However, he would only attend for a single year, having grown more and more opinionated over the span of the year, as well as increasingly individualistic. Philip was craving a return to the Pacific Northwest, and decided to leave Western Maryland College after his first year. He returned to Anchorage, hoping to find his path in life back home. However, what followed was a couple of years spent in limbo, with Philip being unable to get a leg up in the Anchorage region. Unable to make any inroads in Alaska, Philip decided to settle for the next best thing, Washington State, which was beginning to grow significantly at the tail end of the 1980s. It seemed as good a place as any for Philip to really spread his wings, and it wasn't too far away from his home in Alaska. Philip decided to enroll in pre-med at Evergreen State College, a non-traditional liberal arts school down near Olympia, Washington's state capital. This was deemed a rather hasty move by Philip's family, who weren't exactly thrilled with his choice, but they understood it. They supported him through this decision, and they knew that Philip needed to find his own way in life. Despite his parents' objections, Philip decided to drive to his destination, Olympia, Washington, which is just about an hour south of Seattle. However, from his home in Anchorage, it was a trek of roughly 2,300 miles, which he planned to make in his 1983 Volkswagen Jetta, camping along the way. On June 14th, 1988, Philip had packed up almost all of his worldly possessions into his Volkswagen Jetta, including, surprisingly, 2 handguns which he kept locked up. Between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. that day, a Tuesday, Philip set off, hoping to cover hundreds of miles of ground before dark. However, within hours, his trip had already met a detour, when his vehicle began acting up unexpectedly. Philip noticed something was wrong, and made the decision to end his first day early, stopping just outside of an Alaskan town named Tok, one of the last populated towns before a long and desolate stretch of road. That evening, Philip called his parents and told them what had happened. He also told them where he was, having crossed more than 300 kilometers throughout the day. Philip's father, Robert, tried to press him for more details, but Philip, being headstrong and stubbornly independent, minimalized everything. Philip's parents encouraged him to be safe, and just had to trust that he would be okay. He was an adult, already well on his way to starting his own life thousands of miles away, and he had checks, credit cards, and their phone number. If he needed their help, he would let them know. Philip had told his parents that he was going to camp on his way down to Washington, and that's what he told them he was going to do until he got his car fixed. So that night, Philip said goodbye to his parents and seemingly set off to a campsite he had already set up. Unfortunately, this phone call, which again took place on June 14th, 1988, would be the last conversation that Philip would ever have with his loved ones. Five days after Philip departed Anchorage and last spoke to his family, his vehicle was found in Prince George, British Columbia. On June 19th, 1988, his black Volkswagen Jetta was found abandoned in downtown Prince George, where it had been set ablaze inside the bay of a car wash. Firefighters quickly extinguished the blaze, but by the time investigators had a chance to look over the vehicle, its interior had been gutted. This included any evidence of ownership, including license plates, which had presumably been stripped away by whoever had abandoned the vehicle and set it on fire. Corporal Craig Gates of the Prince George Royal Canadian Mounted Police said about this discovery, quote, "The condition of the car after it was burned, it was totally gutted out on the inside due to the fire and fire damage to the outside as well. Nothing was found in the car of any significance." Police were able to determine ownership of the car the very next day using the VIN number, which showed that the vehicle belonged to a Philip Fraser, a young man that resided in Anchorage, Alaska. Officials with the RCMP began reaching out to Alaskan authorities and learned that the vehicle had not been registered as stolen. At least, not yet. That would follow in the subsequent days, as an all-points bulletin was sent out to authorities in the region, which listed not only Philip's license plate, CBJ 358, but Philip Fraser himself. Roughly 1 week after Philip had departed for Washington State, his parents, Doctors Robert and Shirley Fraser, were greeted at their front door by an Anchorage patrolman. The Frasers' home address, which was located on the 1100 block of West 12th Avenue in Anchorage, was the same address that Philip's vehicle was registered at. This Anchorage police officer was performing a wellness check on Philip on behalf of the Prince George RCMP, who were looking to make contact with him. Robert and Shirley Fraser told the patrolman all that they knew, that Philip had set off for Olympia, Washington on June 14th, and that he was planning on camping along the way. They told the officer about the last time they had spoken with him, the phone call from the night he had left, June 14th, and told the officer about his car troubles, which had forced him to call an early stop on the first day of this road trip. In return, Philip's parents were told about what police had found, his vehicle being abandoned and set on fire in Prince George, British Columbia, with neither Philip nor any of his belongings being found anywhere nearby. Following this conversation with the Anchorage patrolman, who wasn't involved in the investigation, the Fraser family made contact with the Prince George RCMP substation, who were actively investigating the case. During this conversation, they learned that Philip had been listed as a missing person, and police were unfortunately suspecting foul play in his disappearance. Philip's father, Robert Fraser, would later recall, quote, "There was no hesitation. I think everyone knew right away. Something just wasn't right. They knew when they found his car on fire with none of his belongings. I was sure there had been foul play, but I kept hoping, thinking of all sorts of alternatives." The investigation to find Philip Fraser was headed by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who I often abbreviate as the RCMP. In particular, the case was given to the General Investigation Section, the GIS, who are well equipped to handle cases such as this. From the beginning, police set off to try and retrace Philip's known travels, hoping to determine what had happened between his last known whereabouts, Tok, Alaska, near the Alaskan-Canadian border, and Prince George, British Columbia, which is several hundred kilometers inland. During this initial span of the investigation, investigators were able to learn that Philip had crossed the Canadian border on June 17, 1988, 2 days before his vehicle was discovered in Prince George. He had checked in at the Beaver Creek Station in Yukon, which is officially known as the Alcon-Beaver Creek Border Crossing. This station is roughly 18 miles away from the Alaska-Canada border, and is known as being one of the most inland border crossings through most of Canada. Here, Philip had signed an RCMP non-resident firearm declaration, which forced him to turn in his 2 handguns to authorities. Within an hour of doing so, he had been back on the road, now without his 2 firearms. However, this still left a 2-day window between Philip crossing into Canada and his vehicle being found in Prince George, more than 2,000 kilometers away. Police took this information to the media, which allowed them to spread the details of this case early on. Unfortunately, many in the region did not exactly keep up with the news, or, in some cases, modern technology. RCMP Corporal Craig Gates stated about this unfortunate setback, referring to media access through the region. Quote, "People out here just don't have access to it. Quite a few families live off of the land around here. We have to visit every rest stop, gas station, campground, and store over thousands of kilometers." As police hit the pavement, hoping to learn as much about Philip's travels as possible, the tips began to flood in. Some of these tips came from Yukon, specifically the Upper Liard region, while others came in from the area around Dease Lake in British Columbia. These tips seemed to fit in with Philip's road trip, which was taking him towards the Seattle region, and police followed up on these potential leads. Soon, investigators were able to confirm that Philip had stayed at a campsite near Dease Lake in the early morning hours of June 18th, which was the day before his vehicle was found. Other tipsters began to claim that Philip had been seen at a campground in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, which was roughly 4.5 hours past Prince George, towards Alberta to the northeast. These tips gave Philip's loved ones a false sense of hope, leading some to believe that he might have abandoned his vehicle in Prince George and then decided to carry on in another fashion, perhaps obtaining another vehicle or hitchhiking, headed eastbound. Officials with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police would even begin running ads for Philip in local newspapers, specifically in the tourist alerts section, hoping that Philip would see them and make contact with his family. Unfortunately, more than a month would pass with no definitive answer. On July 27th, 1988, more than a month after Philip's disappearance, a group of tourists were pulling into a gravel turnaround just off of Highway 37A, known as the Glacier Highway. They were roughly 30 miles east of Stewart, British Columbia, near the southern tip of the Alaskan Panhandle. A group of tourists began to spill out of their vehicle, and a man began walking his dog. The dog led him into a group of thick shrubs, where the body of 23-year-old Philip Fraser would be found, face down and riddled with bullet holes. The tourist immediately set off towards Stewart, which was just about 29 miles away. There, they contacted authorities, who already had an idea of who the remains belonged to. Corporal Craig Gates stated, quote, "At the time of the discovery of the body, it was already well known about the incident of the car burning in the car wash at Prince George. Almost immediately, investigators were looking at the remains being that of Philip Fraser." Two days later, on July 29th, 1988, the remains were positively identified as Philip Fraser. Authorities had received dental records from Alaskan authorities, which made the identification possible. Philip's cause of death was initially revealed as multiple gunshot wounds caused by a handgun, although more specific details have been kept under wraps in the more than 30 years since this discovery. Police have yet to reveal specific details about where Philip had been shot, whether the spot his body was found was the supposed crime scene, etc. However, police would reveal that, due to the decomposition of his body, it was believed that Philip had been killed at around the same time he went missing. This correlated with the time period that his car had been found burning in Prince George, hundreds of kilometers away from his body. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. You have the suspect's fingerprints at the crime scene. You have witnesses testifying that they saw the suspect commit the crime. The suspect has a motive. It's an open and shut case. Or is it? Each week, the Parcast original podcast, Not Guilty, examines controversial criminal cases and tries to determine why solid evidence doesn't always lead to a conviction. What police considered compelling evidence against Casey Anthony in the disappearance of her daughter, Kaylee, defense attorneys classified as fantasy forensics, and she was ultimately acquitted of Kaylee's murder. Amanda Knox served 4 years in an Italian prison for murder, before later being acquitted. Was the media portrayal of Knox the profile of a killer or a televised character assassination? And sometimes, jurors are responsible for wrongful convictions, as was the case when the Central Park Five were convicted, despite DNA evidence showing none of the suspects were involved. Search for and subscribe to Not Guilty wherever you listen to podcasts. Again, search Not Guilty or visit parcast.com/notguilty to listen now. The General Investigation Section of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police continued overseeing this case, with 4 full-time investigators being dispatched by the RCMP. Now though, instead of probing a mysterious disappearance, these investigators were looking into a murder, which spanned hundreds of kilometers of predominantly sylvan terrain. This team of investigators set out to establish a timeline of Philip's travels, hoping that the tips they were receiving from the public could help establish the exact route Philip had taken, and where he had last been seen alive. They continued to explore the area around Dease Lake, where they had confirmed Philip had been at on June 18th, the day before his burnt-out vehicle was found in Prince George. Investigators soon made contact with a potential witness named Gay Frockledge, who had called in a tip a couple of weeks prior to the discovery of Philip's body, who was now being interviewed by investigators eager to learn more. Gay was the owner of the 40 Mile Flats Cafe, a restaurant and gas station about an hour south of Dease Lake. Gay worked at the cafe with her daughter, Tina, and claimed to have not only seen Philip on the afternoon of June 18th, but his alleged killer as well. That afternoon, Gay claimed that someone driving a quote-unquote dark-colored pickup with a light stripe by the side had dropped off a hitchhiker near her cafe. A hitchhiker that, according to Gay, was very off. Quote, just looking at him through the window, it was something wrong. There was something wrong with him, in appearance. I wasn't comfortable. Gay Frockledge was so put off by this lingering hitchhiker that she decided to stick around well beyond her regular working hours because she did not want her daughter to be left alone with him. A short time later, a black Volkswagen Jetta had pulled over into the parking lot of the cafe. The Jetta belonged to Philip Fraser, who did not get out, but had stopped to look for something inside of his car. At around this time, the bizarre hitchhiker had finished up his meal, paying for it with Canadian currency. He then stepped outside and began speaking to Philip, undoubtedly trying to arrange passage in Philip's car. The negotiations seemed to have not gone very well, as the hitchhiker then began to walk away, along Highway 37. Philip remained parked for a few moments, but then began to drive off. As he did, the hitchhiker seemed to run alongside his car for a moment, and eventually, Philip pulled up alongside him and let the man in. The two then drove off together, and Gay Frockledge recalls feeling unsettled by the entire encounter, along with her daughter, Tina, who witnessed this interaction beside her. Investigators began pursuing this lead, hoping to determine what had led from this chance encounter near Dease Lake on June 18th, to Philip's murder and his vehicle being found burning in Prince George the very next evening, on June 19th. This was a distance of nearly 900 kilometers. Police officials would spend the next several weeks traveling along highways 37 and 16, making sure to stop at each restaurant and gas station to hand out flyers with Philip Fraser's photo and information. In the meantime, they also began trying to figure out who this mysterious hitchhiker had been, since he was shaping up to be their most likely suspect. It was even believed that, in addition to Philip's car, this hitchhiker had likely stolen Philip's identity. One investigator later told the media, quote, we thought he would be assuming the identity of Philip Fraser, or his story at least. Making purchases and getting fuel. We kept on putting his name out there. Over the course of this investigation, several witnesses would come forward with descriptions of this mysterious hitchhiker. Many of these witnesses shared the same general description of this man, which created an incredibly unsettling portrait of a potential killer. This hitchhiker was described as a white male in his early to mid-20s, who had a large beer belly, rotten teeth, and strong body odor. He stood around 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighed around 225 pounds, and had brown hair and brown eyes. Most witnesses recall this man having stubble on his face, and he was described as being very unkempt. His walk was described as a waddle, and he was described as having some kind of mental disability. This man was also constantly biting his nails, and was seen chain-smoking American cigarette brands, which he held between his index finger and his thumb, like many do for joints. Despite more than a handful of witnesses recalling specific details about this man, they were unable to determine whether he was Canadian or American. In fact, some of the witnesses that encountered this man recall him telling them details about his life, which may or may not have been total fabrications, if not details stolen directly from Philip Fraser himself. On one occasion, this man told a witness that he had been visiting relatives in Tok, Alaska, where Philip had originally camped on the night he left home. To another witness, this man claimed that he worked for a fish processing plant in Tok. Then, to yet another witness, this man claimed that he was a medical student from Toronto that had just left a friend's wedding in Whitehorse, Yukon, and was hitchhiking home. Maybe all of these details were true, but police considered it unlikely. Some witnesses would recall seeing this man in Philip's vehicle, but almost all of them recall him being the driver and lone occupant. In fact, none recall seeing Philip and this man together. At least, none other than Gay and Tina Frockledge, who witnessed the meeting of the two just outside of their cafe. By the time police learned about this hitchhiker, he seemed to have become a ghost in the wind, having disappeared just as quickly as he emerged. Police would continue their search for this man, expanding their search from restaurants and gas stations to include rest stops, campgrounds, and parks. It wasn't until nearly 2 months later, the very end of summer, that police were able to learn more about this mysterious individual. Eddie and Pauline Olsen were a married couple that lived in Kitwanga, a small village roughly 200 kilometers southeast of Stewart, British Columbia, where Philip Fraser's body had been found. Despite living in Kitwanga, a very small town of less than 500 people, Eddie and Pauline Olsen had unknowingly become eyewitnesses in this investigation, perhaps even the most important eyewitnesses, having spent more time in the company of this mysterious hitchhiker than anyone else that police could find. On the evening of Saturday, June 18th, roughly 8 hours after Philip had picked up the mysterious hitchhiker outside of the cafe, Eddie and Pauline Olsen were driving along Highway 37. They were not too far away from their home when they came across a stranded motorist whose car had broken down. Eddie Olsen later stated, quote, "You could tell he was nervous, but I thought, well, he was just scared being out here this late at night. Didn't want to stay out here because it's kind of a remote area. At this point, I said, we'll just tow you home and figure it out in the morning." The Olsens towed this man's vehicle, a 1983 Volkswagen Jetta, back to their house, and allowed him to stay the night with them. Eddie Olsen later recalled, quote, "He slept downstairs in our basement, and I have about 12 or 15 guns in a gun case down there, and where he slept, the guns were right beside him." The Olsens thought their surprise house guest to be relatively harmless, and thankfully, nothing happened that night. The following morning, the young man met the Olsens upstairs for breakfast. They tried to engage him in conversation, but he seemed secretive and evasive, refusing to even participate in small talk at times. However, at one point, this young man let slip that his parents were physicians in Anchorage, and that he had to start class in Seattle the following day, June 20th. Because of this rush, he was looking to hit the road early, but surprisingly, he offered the Olsens a proposal. He offered to sell his car to them, a black 1983 Volkswagen Jetta that was in relatively good condition. Eddie stepped outside with the young man, and began to inspect the vehicle. It seemed to be fine, other than a few small mechanical and cosmetic issues, which could be fixed quite easily. Eddie was definitely interested in buying the car, especially for below market value, but told the young man that if a deal were to happen, it would have to wait until Monday. He wanted to make sure that the banks were open, and that he could declare the sale through customs. This did not sit well with the young man, who insisted that if a deal were to happen, it had to happen today. The young man then offered to exchange the car for a plane ticket to Seattle, but that offer was also refused by Eddie, who later stated, quote, "The only way I would buy it is if you waited till Monday and we went through customs," and he said that would be too late for him. At this point, the young man tried to thank the Olsens for their hospitality. Despite their reticence, he was hoping to pay them something, and he pulled out 2 separate wallets from his pockets. He extracted $20 American and handed it to Eddie, and then began working on fixing the black Jetta. It turned out that the only issue with the car was that it needed a new fan belt, and this issue was easily fixed. The young man was back on the road sometime between 8:30 and 9 a.m. Roughly 12 hours later, that same vehicle, Philip Fraser's black VW Jetta, was found roughly 300 miles away in Prince George, having been set on fire inside a car wash after closing hours. For some time, Eddie and Pauline Olsen just chalked up the encounter with that broken-down motorist as a weird incident in their lives. It wasn't until several months later that Eddie learned about Philip Fraser's death and saw a composite image of this killer in a gas station that he frequented. Only then did he realize that this composite image resembled the man that had stayed with them months prior. He then contacted authorities and shared their story with investigators. As far as police were aware, the Olsens were the last known people to encounter the supposed killer of Philip Fraser, who had been driving his vehicle and even seemingly masquerading as Philip. Their encounter with this strange young man seemed to fill in a vital period of time, leading police to believe that Philip had died within hours of meeting this unknown hitchhiker. Following the discovery of his body in July of 1988, Philip Innes Fraser was cremated. His ashes were scattered over Otter Lake in his hometown of Anchorage, a spot he had visited with his family numerous times. At the time of his death, he was just 23 years old. Officials with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police would continue searching for answers over the next several months, receiving more than 500 tips by the end of the first year. That October, they conducted multiple searches in garbage dumps around the region of Prince George, looking for many of Philip's belongings, which had seemingly disappeared overnight. These items included a stereo, tapes with handwritten labels, a passport, luggage, camping equipment, and clothing, all of which had been stolen or likely discarded by the killer in the wake of the crime, before he set the vehicle ablaze in the Prince George car wash. It is unknown if police found anything in these searches, but it is unlikely, as the case continued to grow colder with each passing day. Philip's case received a dash of publicity a few years afterwards, in 1992, when his story was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. This segment, which aired close to 4 years after Philip's death, remains one of the show's most haunting segments, which personally gave me the creeps when I first saw it years ago. The entire episode was shot on location, up in Alaska and British Columbia, which really added to the atmosphere of the reenactments. More recently, over the past decade or so, some online theorists have begun to speculate that Philip's killer might have been none other than Michael McGray, a notorious Canadian serial killer who targeted hitchhikers through the 1980s and 1990s. This included men, which is an attribute not generally seen in serial killers or killers of opportunity. Michael McGray was arrested in 1998, and over the next several years, would be charged and convicted of nearly half a dozen murders. These crimes spanned most of Canada, and extended from 1984 to 1998, fitting in with not only the general setting of this crime, but the time frame. In the years since his arrest, McGray has confessed to killing upwards of a dozen people, including victims in the United States, namely Seattle, but has refused to name names. Despite matching the profile of Philip Fraser's killer, including the physical description of the mysterious hitchhiker, police do not believe that Michael McGray is responsible. They have since ruled him out as a suspect, or at least don't have enough evidence to feasibly suspect him. It is unknown how investigators eliminated him as a suspect, but some in the online community continue to believe him to be a possible culprit, and worthy of suspicion. Philip Fraser's case remains unsolved to this day, with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police continuing to explore leads and ideas, even though they've admitted to the case growing cold many years ago. Investigators continue to withhold many of the specific details of the case, such as Philip's exact cause of death. We know that he was shot by his killer, a detail released early on, but we don't really know how many times, or where, or even how. All we know is that the killer used a handgun, and that's about it. These details are undoubtedly guarded because police believe that the case is still solvable, and want to ensure that the integrity of the case is not compromised. The mysterious hitchhiker, who was not only seen masquerading as Philip, but was the last known person to be with him, remains the most likely suspect in this case. However, to this day, this bizarre individual remains unidentified. Investigators have publicly stated that the hitchhiker likely learned everything he could about Philip in a short period of time. Details such as his parents' profession, where he was headed, etc., before eventually killing him. He then made off with all of Philip's belongings whose whereabout remains unknown to this day. This includes all of Philip's legal documents, his driver's license, his passport, his birth certificate, etc., in addition to all of his credit cards and checkbooks. The killer likely masqueraded as Philip for a brief period of time, at least long enough for him to make his getaway. It remains unknown who exactly this young man was, or why he targeted Philip, but police believe that this unknown hitchhiker was familiar with the Seattle and Toronto regions, and that following this crime, he likely returned to one of those areas afterwards. If he is still alive today, he would likely be in his early to mid-50s, if not older. The loved ones of Philip Fraser continue to hold out hope that justice can be found, but Philip's father, the renowned Dr. Robert Fraser, passed away in 2014 at the age of 83. At the time of his death, he still believed that Philip's killer could be found, but more than 5 years after his death, answers continue to elude Philip's loved ones. Until this mysterious killer is identified, the story of Philip Innes Fraser remains unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. Once again, I would like to thank my friend Damien, who operates the website American Crime Journal. He supplied the lion's share of the work for this episode, and originally encouraged me to cover Philip's story many months ago. I'm bummed it took me this long to get around to it, but I'd like to thank Damien for all of his hard work. Make sure to check out his website, American Crime Journal, by heading to mytruecrime.com. Also, if you are interested in hearing about criminal cases from Canada, such as this one, make sure to check out the podcast Canadian True Crime. The show has consistently been one of my favorites over the past couple of years, and Christy, the host, is one of the nicest and most supporting people in the true crime podcast sphere. I'm going to play a promo for her show in just a moment, so make sure to give it a listen and subscribe to Canadian True Crime. If you would like to learn more about this show, you can head to the Unresolved website at unresolved.me. That's unresolved.me. In addition to having links to all of the episodes there, I also post the transcripts of each episode with all of my sources and music listed. You can also find whatever you may need at the site, whether it be a link to our social media pages, an email contact form, or a link to the Unresolved Patreon page. Patrons of Unresolved can get access to all kinds of perks, such as bonus Unresolved mini-episodes, early commercial-free access to each episode, and my new exclusive podcast, Resolved, which is available only on Patreon. I also recently allowed patrons to go above and beyond in their support and become a producer, and I'd like to thank those producers right now. Ben Krokum, Laura Hannan, Quil Carter, Stephen Wilson, Scott Meesey, Timothy Stratton, and Katherine Vatalaro? Sorry, I know I bungled that, but all of you, thank you for your continued support. It means the world to me. You guys and gals are the inaugural producers of Unresolved, and I cannot thank you enough. That thank you really goes out to all of you other patrons and listeners too. I would have quit this show a long time ago without your encouragement, so thank you for sticking by me for almost 4 years now. Words cannot express how grateful I am. Now, I've already been blabbing enough, and thankfully, I don't have another long-winded rant like I did last week. In a moment, I'm going to play a promo for my friend Christy over at Canadian True Crime, but for now, I'm gonna skedaddle. I just want to let you all know that we have the big episode 100 coming up next week, and like always, I want to pick an extra juicy story to cover for this big milestone. I'm covering a really high-profile story that a lot of you have been requesting over the past year or so, which I teased a couple of weeks back, so be on the lookout for that. Until then, everyone, stay safe, and I will talk to you later.
Canada may be known as the friendliest country in the world, but make no mistake, it has some of the most shocking criminal cases too. Canadian True Crime takes a deep dive into some of Canada's most well-known crime stories as well as others you probably haven't heard of, one case at a time. If you like straightforward, fact-based crime stories and don't mind them being told by an Australian living in Canada, you can find me on your favourite podcast app just by searching for Canadian True Crime.